Thank you, Zach and team. I know Zach is fighting a cold, and that's a tough thing to do, to lead worship when you're not feeling 100%. Appreciate it. All right. Home stretch. Daniel chapter 11. If you have your Bibles, please turn in your Bibles to chapter 11. If you don't happen to have a copy of the scriptures with you, we provided a printout of Daniel 11 and is in the insert inside your bulletin. Such a long chapter, it required an insert. And we got another passage on the page opposite of the notes. A lot to discuss, a lot to cover. I don't know if you took the time. I don't know if you've taken the time at any point during this series to read ahead. I hope you have. But if you did this week, it was a lot to read, a lot to take in, and we're going to try to make some sense of all of that. There's a great deal of history for us on this side of the timeline. There's a great deal of history involved in chapter 11, and I understand that that's not everyone's favorite subject. Henry Ford, I guess, famously said that history is, quote, more or less bunk. In his mind, history was a preoccupation with the past, and it got in the way of thinking and living creatively in the present. Joseph Heller was the author of my favorite novel, Catch-22, and his description of history is, quote, a trash bag of random coincidences torn open in the wind. It's a little bit cynical, just a little bit cynical. In other words, stuff happens, it's all meaningless, and it's all coincidental. Well, I hope you don't believe that. But again, you might find history boring. Maybe you had a history teacher that was consumed with dates of events more than the significance of the events themselves. Although to their defense, my guess is they were often trying to give context to what they were teaching, and we missed it. Knowing history, though, does more for us than simply make us appear intelligent in conversations. It helps us more than answer a few questions in Jeopardy. One of the things that makes Daniel 11 so interesting is that for Daniel, what we have in chapter 11 is prophecy. For Daniel, it's prophecy. For us, it's history. And it is incredibly accurate history. It's important for us to realize this. Daniel, in the 6th century BC, is given a vision, an incredibly accurate vision of events that will transpire in the 2nd century, 400 years later, and in fact, to the very end of time. It is so detailed, it is so accurate, the prophecy given in chapter 11, that many scholars have chosen and concluded that it must have been written in the 2nd century after the fact. That it could not be prophecy because it's so detailed and so true to history. But that perspective says that God is contained within history. That He's kind of watching life unfold at the same time we are. And I don't believe that, and I don't believe you believe that. Remember, chapters 10 through 12 are a single unit, beginning with Daniel praying, remember, for 3 weeks when he hears that the first exiles to leave Babylon and to go back to Jerusalem, to rebuild Jerusalem, meet strong resistance, and the entire program shuts down. That brings Daniel to a place of mourning and fasting and praying. We don't know the specifics of Daniel's prayer, but if God's response tells us anything, Daniel must have been in prayer again about the future of God's people. Will they exist much longer? Will they be so scattered around the world that they won't matter? Does God still have a plan for them? Or does the empire of Persia get the last word from Daniel's perspective? Will things get better or will they get worse? Knowing Daniel, I doubt seriously that he wondered whether or not God cared, but he may have prayed about how God's care would be experienced because it was all unknown. So from this side of history, we know the answers to those questions. And if we could go back in time, we'd love to tell Daniel that God's people will survive and they will even thrive. But we don't need to do that. God gives him a vision. It begs the question, are we that much different from Daniel? Have you caught yourself wondering in your heart some of the same things Daniel must have wondered? What is the result of all of this? What's the end? When is the end? Have you found yourself worrying that evil is winning? On a global political scale, in your own personal life? Have you doubted if there really is a prescribed end? Or will it just come randomly? For those reasons, I think Daniel 11, in all of its difficulty, is one of the most important visions in the book. It's long, as I said, it's detailed. It's the kind of chapter that can leave you scratching your head and just say, all right, I'm going to Philippians now. I'm going to something I can at least get my mind wrapped around. The reformer and church historian John Calvin took 100 pages to cover Daniel 11 in his commentary on Daniel. We're not going to spend that much time. I heard the gasp. But my approach to this text is going to be very similar to my 8th grade math teacher who would say, I'll get you started, Ty, but I'm not going to do the work for you. So this morning, I'm going to try to get you started. But I can't do all the work for you. That's going to be in your hands, all right? Now, the first thing to know is that Daniel 11 is kind of fleshing out in greater detail the visions of chapter 7 and 8. Chapter 7 was the vision of the 4 beasts, and it went through history in just the snap of a finger. Empire after empire after empire, Babylonians, Medo-Persians, Greeks, Romans, and it just kind of goes by very quickly. Chapter 8 then focuses more on the Persian Empire giving way to the Greek Empire. Chapter 11 fleshes out more detail than those 2 chapters, those 2 visions gave. As such, the chapter breaks down into what I would consider 3 major phases of history. Not all of history until the very, very end, but 3 major phases of history. So, this is not a typical sermon because this is not a typical text. But the question out there that we have to answer is, does God want us to learn something about Him in this text? Why give us a chapter like chapter 11 if God doesn't want us to learn something about Him? So the very opening phrase of verse 2 of Daniel 11 is compelling. And now I will show you the truth. It's not just the truth about history, but about the end of history and about God's part in that. There is a plan and there is a purpose under God's control, and God is showing Daniel what is true, meaning He's the author of it. He knows it. Then there's a quick synopsis of the end of the Persian Empire. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up against the kingdom of Greece. That's just history. Again, prophecy for Daniel, but we know, looking back, there were 3 more Persian kings. The 4th was the greatest. His name was Xerxes. It's the Greek name for Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. He's the one who took Esther to be his wife, to be his queen, Xerxes. He goes to battle against Greece in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, is defeated. And that's the end of the Persian Empire. Just like that, it's gone. The Babylonian Empire came, looked like it was insurmountable, it was gone. The Persian Empire, replace it, looks like it's insurmountable, it's gone. Some 150 years later, Alexander the Great comes on the scene. Verse 3, then a mighty king shall arise, Alexander the Great, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he is arisen, and remember we looked at that in chapter 8, his rise was meteoric. But as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. Alexander the Great conquers the known world in a short amount of time, and as soon as it's done, he dies. And he doesn't leave it to any of his family, not his posterity. God is telling Daniel these things. We know it from history. It goes to his four generals, and we looked at that in chapter 8. Now, if you want to go to a history book on ancient civilizations, you can get on Amazon and order a Cambridge Book of World History, all 7 volumes if you're inclined. And there you would find hundreds of pages devoted to Alexander the Great. In chapter 11, God mentions him in 2 sentences. Because Daniel's concern, or more precisely, God's concern for Daniel, is for the people of God. So what follows is a history as it pertains to Israel. And what you will read is the ongoing battle between 2 of those 4 generals that the kingdom of Greece fell to after Alexander the Great died. We listed all 4 of them back in chapter 8. I'm just going to refer to 2 because these are the 2 that pertain to Israel. Ptolemy was the king of Egypt. He will be the king of the south, or his reign will be the king of the south throughout the rest of chapter 11. Seleucid was the general who took over the king of the north, or Syria. And he and his ancestors are going to be that king throughout the rest of chapter 11. Okay? Ptolemy, Egypt, south. Seleucid, Syria, north. So what happens in verses 5 through 20 is what I call the first phase of history, again, specifically as it pertains to Israel, is wars and very little peace. If I could sum it up that way, that's how I would sum up verses 5 through 20. Wars and very little peace. And the reason for its significance is that these 2 kingdoms, Egypt, Ptolemy's south, Syria, Seleucid's north, are going to fight back and forth, and guess who is caught in the middle? Israel. They're right in the middle of this. That's why it pertains to them. That's why it's important for God that Daniel sees this, records it, and holds on to it. We're not going to read all of it, but let me just read a section. Chapter 11, verse 5. Read with me. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. And from a branch from her roots, one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come unto the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. Why are we preaching on this? All right. Let me give you, here are the notes I took on my class from Daniel in last May up at Regent College in Vancouver. Let me just read you this little section. And I'm scribbling as fast as I can. How many of you took history class where the professor just starts spouting off history, and if you dropped your pencil, you lost 500 years? You know what I'm talking about? So that's kind of what was going on here. I'm writing as fast as I can, and he's just spouting it out. Ptolemy, king of the south. And I'm trying to read my writing. Persuades Antiochus II, king of the north, to take his daughter as his wife, and her name is Bernice. So they're trying to have some kind of, let's settle things. But Antiochus is already married to a woman named Laodice, but he divorces her in order to marry Bernice. Ptolemy II dies in 246 BC. Antiochus changes his mind about his divorce to Laodice, takes her back, makes her son his legal heir. His name is Seleucus II. So here's Bernice from Egypt, given to the king of the north in marriage. Now she's out on her own, but she's already had a son by Antiochus. Are you with me? Is this making sense? So she's a little upset. And is angry, I wrote. I can understand. Her son, Ptolemy III, attacks Antiochus in a battle that lasts 3 years, 246, or 5 years, 246 to 241 BC. This is what's described in 11, 7 through 9. So again, if you want to check me on this, and please do, go to Amazon, get the Cambridge Book of World History, all 7 volumes, and you can read this stuff for yourself. Joyce Baldwin, in her commentary, said, unless the readers are serious students of ancient history, most of the allusions in Daniel 11 will completely baffle them. Well, I'm here to tell you she's right, right? If any of us are experts in ancient history, it'll make more sense. But folks, to throw up our hands, to go here and say, oh, this doesn't make sense, on to Hosea it is. Let's take the Bible out of the realm of our 5-minute devotionals, okay? Difficult as it is. Let's take the Bible out of that realm. Go to your website, find a verse that's highlighted, that's easily posted on Facebook, and call that good. Our Awana kids know better than that. Their theme verse is to be a workman approved who handles the word of truth, right? Our kids know this. It's time for us adults sometimes to step up. It's hard, but sometimes Bible study is hard. Now, I was thumbing through my wife Wendy's NLT, New Living Translation, study Bible. And I thought I would just check her, and I got to chapter 11, and there's 2 whole pages of history inserted into her Bible about the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. So it's there for you. Get a study Bible. If you don't have a study Bible, that's a good place to start. Most of them are really good about giving historical and language context to what we're talking about, and so that it will make more sense. And if you can't afford a study Bible, because they are expensive, see one of the elders. We need to get that into your hands. We'll do that. We'll make that happen. I'm declaring that right here and now without their permission. Okay? God is telling Daniel these things because he wants his people to know that for reasons we may never understand, he is allowing spiritual battle to wage on. Its expression is on earth. Remember, that was last week, chapter 10. There's a spiritual battle being waged in the heavenly realms. We see the results, if you will, on earth. So there will be trials and there will be tribulations, but they are not random and they are not outside God's control. Just because we can't explain history, why things happen doesn't mean it's random or accidental. So this back and forth between north and south is the focus all the way through verse 20. Phase 2, the antitype of the Antichrist in chapter 11, verses 21 through 35. Antitype just means a symbolic figure, a foreshadowing, if you will. I happen to believe that the New Testament teaches that at the end there will be an Antichrist. 1 John chapter 2, what Paul calls the man of lawlessness, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Because that figure is still ahead, there is a foreshadowing of this individual seen most clearly, at least from Daniel's perspective, in one of the kings of the north named Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. And we kind of covered some of this back in chapter 8. He was the little horn of chapter 8. He was one of those most responsible for tragedies among the Jews, and ultimately committed what the text calls the abomination that makes desolate, that just kind of empties out the temple of God. You'll see in verse 21, he rose to power through flattery and deception, verse 23. He is described as contemptible in verse 21 and deceitful in verse 23. He is a bad character. God tells Daniel that this person will, quote, profane the temple and fortress, verse 31, and will take away the regular burnt offerings before his abominable act. That abominable act was that he set up an altar to Zeus in the temple of God. It has been rebuilt by now. It was stopped for a period of time, but it did eventually get rebuilt. Some 400 years later, Antiochus rises to power in the north, dedicates an altar to Zeus in God's temple, and sacrifices a pig on it. That's the abomination that's referred to. Sets himself up as a competitor to Israel's God and thinks he has won. But don't miss verse 24. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his father's father have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods, and he shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. He's limited. Again, in reasons that only God knows, but makes clear to Daniel for the future of Israel, when it looks like it's at its worst, when it looks like Israel might be no more, it's only for a time. He is presented again then as an antitype or a foreshadowing of the Antichrist. See, this is one of the features of Old Testament prophecies. They are been described, maybe if you've read, you've heard this illustration of like a telescope that stretches out. It sees the present and the near future, but it also has visions of far-reaching future. In other words, it's kind of like sometimes prophecy is about the now, and it's also sometimes about the not yet. And Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, is like a now when you get to the second century, and the not yet. He's an antitype of the Antichrist, the not yet. Much like when you read the Psalms, there's talk about the reign or the son of David, but it has implications for the Messiah. Now, but not yet. So Antiochus is strong, very strong, but only for a time. Important phrase. The same thing applies then to the key figure of phase 3 of history, the rise and fall of the man of lawlessness, verses 36 through 45, the end of the chapter. So we are going to move from appointed times to what is called the time of the end, verse 40. Now, a lot of controversy swirls around this section of chapter 11. I believe, along with many others, that beginning with verse 36, we are now talking about the Antichrist. We're no longer talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. We're talking about the man of lawlessness. So, if you have your bulletin and you want to follow along, listen to how Paul describes the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning with verse 3. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come, very end, the judgment, the return of Christ, unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Self-deification. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things, and you know what is restraining him now, that he may be revealed in his time? For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he is out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth. This one who looks undefeatable. His fortress will seem impregnable. Everything about him will seem all-powerful, and he will be defeated by the breath of Jesus' mouth. Just like that, in an instant. And he'll bring nothing by the appearance of his coming. Bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing because they refused to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Now, listen, read with me, chapter 11 of Daniel, beginning with verse 36. And the king shall do as he wills. I believe he's referring now to the Antichrist, the same one in 2 Thessalonians 2. He shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god. Does this sound familiar? And shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women, a phrase no scholar understands what that means. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the god or fortresses instead of these. A god whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones, costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. And they will think they have arrived. They will think that they are in good standing. He shall make them rulers over many and shall divide the land for a price. No wonder they refuse righteousness, because they think they have it all. Now, verse 40 and following talks about that moment, that time, the end of history. Hard to wrap our minds around the fact that history will end. This doesn't go on forever. And it's going to describe in terms that Daniel can understand. I don't think literally an army of chariots and horsemen are going to defeat the Antichrist, but that's what Daniel could understand. Those were weapons of his warfare that he would know. So personally, I don't believe that's literal, but I do believe it's literalistic in that the end will come in a battle like this. And when it seems as though the Antichrist has won and is victorious and is stronger than any force in heaven and earth, with the breath of his mouth. So if you read verse 40 and following, don't have time to write, I'm already pressed. But let's just look at the end, verse 45. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, Zion. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. Just like that. I mean, he builds this up. Here's this powerful entity, self-deified, people flocking to his reign. And in one sentence, God says it's done. He shall come to his end. His rise will seem insurmountable. It is not. As quickly as Alexander the Great's end was described in verse 3, so will this man of lawlessness end. This is where history is leading, and God is the author. So, let me offer very quickly 3 lessons, I think, from this history. And I know we glossed over chapter 11. I'm willing to discuss this in greater detail over barbecue at Joe's. You buy. If you're that interested, you buy. It is hot in here, isn't it? Okay, and this is really helping this history lesson. You guys are good. 3 lessons. First, the Most High rules the kingdoms of men. Let us not forget that. The Most High rules the kingdoms of men. That has been one of the passages that we have highlighted throughout this study. Chapter 4 and verse 17. The sentence is by decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of men. I was reminded and went back and checked in the book Kingdoms in Conflict by the late Chuck Colson. He wrote in that, you remember Chuck Colson was an advisor, high-ranking advisor to President Nixon. And he wrote, one of the things about us is that we thought we were running the world. And then he described in some detail a meeting between himself, President Nixon, and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger before Nixon's historic first trip to China. Kissinger opened the meeting with these words, "Gentlemen, what we do today will determine the future history of the world." Colson said, I literally got goosebumps. He said, I thought to myself, I'm determining the future history of the world. And then it wasn't until he was in prison that he realized his arrogance. Proverbs 19:21, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. One thing we learn from this history is the Most High rules the kingdoms of men. Secondly, there is a finality to all earthly kingdoms and empires. So we highlighted verse 24. Antiochus Epiphanes will have his time, but only for a time. Verse 27, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. Verse 29, at the time appointed. Verse 35, until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. There is nothing open-ended about these kingdoms. There's nothing vague in God's history, nothing eternal or permanent about earthly empires. God raises them, He lowers them. The empires and dynasties of the world are written in the history books. We look back and we can see their rise and their demise, but in the moment they seem invincible, they seem impossible to overcome, that they will never end. Ask any Englishman at the turn of the 20th century about the British Empire, and they would have said confidently, "We ruled the world." And they did. And they sung about it. It was not until this week that I heard the word. You know that every time you see a movie or a TV show and it shows England, you hear this dun 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 dun. Does anyone know the words? Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. And those kids would sing that. They would sing it to the top of their lungs and grow up believing that. I wonder how many Britons feel like they're not slaves to the European Union right now. They're not in chains. Third lesson, God is sovereign and in control. There's probably a more clever way to say it, but let's just say it again. Let's keep repeating it until we get it ingrained in our minds. God is sovereign and in control. This past week, the pastors were in Indianapolis for the Gospel Coalition Conference, and John Piper in his sermon reminded me of this passage. Look at Jeremiah 1, verse 12. This is powerful. Then the Lord said to me, "You have seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it." He is still watching over His word. He is still performing His word. And so is this the God you believe in? Even when history doesn't make sense and it baffles us and it seems illogical or chaotic, when we suffer trials of so many kinds, do we believe that He is watching over His word to perform it, that He is sovereign and in control? So we can sing, symbolically, we can sing Rule Britannia, or we can sing Have Thine Own Way, Lord. Well, going against every grain of good preaching, I'm just going to give you another list of 3 in succession. I don't want us to walk out of here thinking, well, all right, good history lesson. Never liked history, but I see what you're saying. Ty, I've got needs that seem, they don't even apply to this. I'm struggling with family issues, work issues, relationship issues, health issues. What do I do with this? Well, let me offer from the text what I think we do with this. Let's apply this. The first application. Yours and my highest priority in this life is to know God. It's not to fix all of our problems. It's not to fix the problems of the people even that we love. Our highest priority in this life is to know God. Tucked inside the middle of this chapter is a critically important verse. Now, if you remember, we mentioned in the sermon on chapter 8 that according to Jewish history, most of the Jews, in order to avoid persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes, compromised their faith. We know this because in early Jewish writing, that's not in our Bibles, but is recognized as historically relevant and true, First Maccabees is what it's called, wrote in the first chapter of that book that some among the Jews were saying, let's come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble. So let's just give in. Let's live in some kind of peace and harmony, because we will avoid a lot of persecution, a lot of trials, a lot of tribulation. We'll save ourselves a lot of headaches if we'll just give in and get along. And that opened a floodgate of compromised beliefs and practices. But not everyone caved in. Verse 32, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Therein lies a responsibility of everyone who can hear me right now. Because I'm convinced things are going to get worse. Not better, but worse. And if this history is also prophecy for us, it will get so bad at some point. The temptation to compromise, to give in, to be part of the power instead of part of the resistance will be great. But the people who know their God will resist. Our highest priority is to know Him, to know His holiness, His power, His faithfulness, His sovereign control, and then to stand firm and take action. I don't think that means to pick up earthly weapons of warfare. I think it means to take up spiritual armor and warfare. I have remembered, since first reading it, J.I. Packer, in his book, Knowing God, a book that's on a lot of your bookshelves, 4 points about people who know God. And the first one of those is that those who know God have great energy for God. I love how he says that. Those who know God, really know Him, have great energy for Him. They take action. But what I forgot when I went back and pulled that book off my shelf just this week, what I forgot was that for this point, and actually for the next 3 points, that people who know God have great thoughts of God, they have great contentment in God, and for the life of me now, I already forgot the 4th one. But to make those points, he goes to the book of Daniel. And for this point, he goes specifically to chapter 11, verse 32. People who know God take action. They don't sit by idly. They're not spectators. And most often they will go against the crowd. Most often this will be done as a minority while others watch. Second point of application, our highest duty is to witness about God. So the very next verse, verse 33, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. It will not be easy to be a witness. We're going to help people understand. Understand what? Understand that there's more to life than meets the eye. There's more to life than this. There's more to life than bigger houses, newer cars, growing bank accounts. There's more to life than that. And the wise will help people understand that, or they at least share it. Thirdly, our highest privilege is to pray. This text begins in prayer. Again, chapters 10, 11, and 12 are one unit. It begins with Daniel in prayer. Little doubt, knowing Daniel, it would end in prayer. Prayer for patient endurance, prayer for himself, for God's people, prayer for wisdom, prayer for the end to come when the enemy of God would at last be defeated and the glory of God ultimately revealed. Because what it looks like ahead are rough days. The enemy will appear as the most powerful force of the universe, yet he shall come to his end. As Paul said, then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing simply by the appearance of his coming. I'm going to ask the worship team to come on back up. We're going to conclude with a couple of songs, I think, that remind us of this. The first of which was written in the 16th century by a fellow you may have heard of named Martin Luther. He wrote this song after his study in the book of Revelation, which, as you've heard me say, I think Daniel is like the Old Testament cousin of the book of Revelation. And when Martin Luther was confronted with the reality of the power of the Christ, the one who would defeat the Antichrist, he wrote among the words we're going to sing in just a moment, "And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us." That is true globally, that is true historically, that is true personally in your life. So let's celebrate this victory this morning. Would you stand with me and let's sing a couple songs in closing.